Hi everybody, it's Miss Kennedy again. Today I'm going to talk to you about how all the pollutants we've been studying affect health of humans and of other organisms. So I wanted to start with a meme because this is how I feel right now. It's late at night and I don't want to make this video, and I just feel like this cat, and I also feel like this cat every day I wake up, so I think it's very relevant. Okay, so we talked about biomagnification and accumulation today, and I just wanted to go over it to reinforce it. So bioaccumulation is the increase of any pollutant, the concentration of that pollutant from an environment to an organism in a food chain. So if you're just focusing on the fish, how much of a certain contaminant or pollutant is in their systems over time. And these kinds of chemicals or pollutants are usually fat soluble, meaning they dissolve in fat. So most organisms, most mammals have a lot of fatty tissue that these chemicals will absorb really easily into. So that's bioaccumulation, just how much of a chemical can accumulate in one species or one organism over time. Biomagnification is a little bit different. It's the increase in that concentration of whatever pollutant from one organism to another in the food chain. So as organisms eat each other, they're kind of passing on that pollutant and it starts to build up. So you can see there's low levels of the pollutant here in these shellfish, a little bit higher levels in the fish, even higher levels in the seal, and the highest levels in the polar bear because it's consuming a larger organism that has larger amounts of the pollutant in them. And these chemicals, as they get stored in your tissue, your fish's tissue, can cause a lot of different things. Eggshell thinning for animals that lay eggs, which can be a threat to the development of the baby or even kill the unborn baby. It can also lead to developmental deformities in carnivores like polar bears, so their babies develop in weird ways as these pollutants remain in the ecosystem. For humans, that would also kind of be these top consumers or the top apex predator. We can experience issues like reproductive, nervous, and circulatory systems. I'm sorry, this is supposed to say systems, but I'm too tired to go change it. So as we eat these polluted animals, we're receiving those chemicals that can also damage our own systems as well. And some common chemicals that we see accumulating and magnifying are mercury, which we looked at today, from the burning of fossil fuels and runoff into our waters, and a chemical called DDT, which was used as an insecticide for a long time, meaning it was sprayed over farms and things like that to combat against pests. But then scientists realized that DDT caused a lot of damage to animals and human health. So there's this broad term called endocrine disruptor. So this is kind of going back to living environment a little bit with biology here, but an endocrine disruptor is a chemical that can interfere with your endocrine system. And endocrine systems are the systems that regulate your hormones, and hormones are involved in many different life processes. So if these chemicals are interfering with your hormones, a lot of different things can happen, like birth defects, disorders when you're developing as a child, gender imbalances, and things like that. So if you look at this first picture here, you can see that these receptors exist on all of our cells. They're there to grab things like hormones, take them into the cells, and do what they're meant to do. But an endocrine disruptor, like a chemical, like lead or anything on this list, mercury, will attach onto the receptors of our cells and kind of take over and make it impossible for the hormones to attach. So there's a lot of different complications there. This is a list of the dirty dozen common endocrine disruptors, common chemicals that alter our hormones, not just us, but other animals as well. There are also some known or suspected endocrine disrupting chemicals over here. That's a little bit more general, like pesticides and metals. Mercury can fall within that category. So this is a little bit more broad. The dirty dozen is very specific chemicals. And so a lot of the endocrine disruptors and things like DDT and mercury are also called persistent organic pollutants, or POPs or POPs. So POPs don't break down very easily in an environment because they're synthetic carbon-based molecules like DDT. They're manufactured, they're not necessarily found excuse me, in nature, so that makes them a little bit harder to deteriorate. They stay in a system for a very long time. And a lot of POPs, I already mentioned this, but they're toxic because they're soluble in fat, meaning they'll dissolve into fat easily, so it allows them to build up into fatty tissue of different organisms. So they're pretty tough, they're pretty bad. And they also can travel over long distances through wind and water, so they can go from a factory into the atmosphere, back down onto land, and then they can start that process of biomagnification. They stay in an ecosystem and around an ecosystem for a long time, so they kind of suck. So I'm not sure why this has to be on this test, but there's this concept called the lethal dose of 50%, or LD50. And it's any dose or like quantity of a chemical that is lethal, meaning deadly, to 50% of the population of a specific species. So let's say you're talking about rats. Usually this is in a lab or something, when rats and mice are often used to be test subjects. So if you want to know what's the lethal dose of water that will kill over 50% of rats in a lab, then scientists will just do experiments until they figure out that lethal dose, which would be this measurement here, 90,000 milligrams per kilogram of water injected into a rat will kill it, and at least 50% of the population die at this dosage. Some might not die, maybe for other reasons, but this would be the LD50 right here. So this is the LD50 for water in rats. There's a lot of different substances being tested. For our purposes, things like gasoline and other environmental pollutants would be a little more interesting, but still it's kind of a strange concept. But this information, LD50, can help to help establish limits or kind of regulations on job or occupational exposure to certain chemicals. So if we know the lethal dose of certain chemicals that people are being exposed to in their factories, better laws can be put into place to protect human health. We can also use this to aid in the event of a major spill or disaster, using this information of LD50. If we know what dosage of a certain pollutant is going to kill a majority of fish or crabs or whatever, we can try and deal with that situation better, faster, and help to save a species if it ever came to that. So it's kind of an extreme event. And again, this is a weird concept. I hope it's not a big part of the test this year, but again, just the dose of a chemical that is deadly to 50% of the population of a species. Another weird concept here is the dose response curve. It's super simple though. It just plots the dose of a substance, meaning how much of a substance is given, versus the effect or response to that dose. Okay, so at 10, whatever measurements this is, the dose is 10 here. This is the response. There's not a big response. As you increase the dosage, the response or the effect increases. So this works on many different drugs. It can also work on toxins to study the effect of the dosage of that toxin on an organism or a whole population. Okay, so again, going a little bit more back to living environment or biology, we're going to talk about pathogens a little bit. So pathogens, they're kind of vicious almost. They adapt to stay alive. They want to continue to infect and spread all throughout human populations because it's what they're designed to do. And some pathogens can occur in many environments. I'm sorry, there's a typo again. I don't want to change it. This should say many. Even if the environments appear to be sanitary, the pathogens are still occurring. So I think a good example of this would even be corona, because you think, New York America is a developed country, it's sanitary and clean, and yet we have seen a few cases of corona here. Same thing with a lot of the cities that corona's broken out in. It's not developing countries. Most of these countries are developed and appear to be sanitary and clean, and yet the virus is still able to infect and kill. So how climate change is involved in this conversation about diseases is that, equatorial type climate zones, so warmer, humid climates, as they start to spread north with climate change, and south, as they start to become kind of the dominant climate. And they'll kind of take over from areas that are subtropical and temperate, like what we have in New York. And pathogens or diseases that prefer this kind of warmer, humid equatorial climate are going to spread with the changing temperatures. So maybe they hadn't been in New York before, but as New York gets warmer, as the temperature changes, the diseases will start to move in. So a little bit scary. And then how are economics involved? This one's kind of obvious, but areas where there's a lot of poverty, low income families, and communities, they lack a lot of sanitation, proper waste disposal, and have contaminated drinking water like we saw with Flint. So with Flint, we focused mostly on the lead in the water, but there was also an outbreak of cholera, which is an infectious disease, which kind of just goes to show you that areas with weak economies, with many people that are in poverty, with a lack of cleanliness and contaminated drinking water, can kind of create a space for diseases to spread. So those areas, those cities are more at risk than cleaner cities, but very few cities are clean, so everybody's at risk, but these like weaker economies are at greater risk. So these are a few important diseases to know. You know a lot of them, and I'm not going to bore you by just reading out over them. So take time to pause and try to better understand the diseases you're not very familiar with. I'm assuming that by this time next year, coronavirus will be a part of this part of the test. It will definitely be taught, but for now, I'm sticking to what I know will be on the test, and it's most likely going to be some of these diseases. And I just talked about cholera. It's a bacterial disease that you get from infected water. So people in Flint contracted cholera. I'm sure you've heard of Zika. It's caused by infected mosquitoes biting you and can also be transmitted through sexual contact, which people don't know as much. People don't often know that. But yeah, I'm not going to read over all of them, but please make sure that you feel like you know at least what kind of disease each of these is and how it's spread. And the last thing I want to talk about is something really interesting, and it's how pathogens can affect pollution. So we're going to focus on corona, which is the pathogen here. And I actually wanted to shout out Esther because she sent me this over the weekend, and it made me really excited to know that sometimes y'all make connections to this class outside of class, so it just made me very happy. But it's really, really interesting. So this picture here was taken in, it's kind of a compilation of January and February of 2019, and this area is actually believed to is where corona first appeared. And this area of China has quite a few factories. So these are tropospheric nitrogen dioxide emissions, so the density of those gases that are emitted by factories. So you can see there's quite a lot of emissions in 2019 in these areas. Fast forward to 2020 during this massive outbreak of corona in these areas, and what do you notice? There are no nitrogen dioxide emissions at all. There are a couple hotspots here and there, but compared to how it was in 2019, there's almost no emissions from these factories because they're all closed, because this outbreak put this entire area of China on pause, like it's a desert. There's no people, no life there because everyone's quarantined or evacuated due to the virus. So none of the factories are operating. So no pollution is being added to the atmosphere. None of the nitrogen dioxides, which are a nose clip or Clean Air Act pollutant, none of that pollutant is in the atmosphere or being emitted into the atmosphere at this time in 2020. That's not to say it's not already still in the atmosphere from the months before, but it's kind of put a pause on how many new pollutants are being added. So I think it's really, really interesting to think about what could this mean if the entire world pauses for a minute as this outbreak continues. What will our environment look like? Will it be enough time for it to bounce back? Will it cause any change at all? I think it's a really, really, really interesting question that kind of connects everything we've been talking about with pollution to all these different diseases I'm teaching about now. So it's kind of perfect timing, although I do hope that nothing bad happens in New York. So please wash your hands, please be safe, and take care of yourselves. That's it for me today. I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.